And welcome. First, thanks to Pioneer Institute for assembling this panel and bringing all these nice people together, and for the Independence Institute for hosting us and providing facilities today. Grateful for that. By way of just launching the discussion and moving into the panel discussion, I guess let me introduce myself. My name is Bob Schaffer. I'm the chairman of the State Board of Education, and concluded my last meeting today, just a few hours ago, over at the State Board of Education room in the Department of Education building. And that meeting was the discussion very similar to what we're having here today, and that is on the topic of the Common Core Standards, other federal issues, or federal initiatives and multi-state initiatives that all lead in a very similar and consistent direction, and that is to harmonize the efforts of states with respect to standards, assessment, and, in my opinion, ultimately curriculum. This is an initiative that has presented itself in seemingly independent and uncoordinated ways, but I am persuaded that these initiatives are actually very well coordinated and have been planned for some period of time. In the let's see, would have been I don't remember exactly the year, but it would have been in the 1990s, late 1990s. I was a member of the U.S. Congress, and there was a letter that was written to let's see, when was Clinton first elected? 93. In 93 was first elected. I got there a little later, but there was a letter that was written by a gentleman named Mark Tucker, and Mark Tucker, the letter starts out, "Dear Hillary." That became known as the title of the letter. The "Dear Hillary" letter is an expression of enthusiasm that the Clintons had just won the White House, and that's actually what the first line says, and how enthusiastic that Mark Tucker and his friends have been about the victory of Bill Clinton as president, and Hillary Clinton also being in the White House. The letter was written to her. And it mapped out a plan for charting a new direction in American education, and it actually references the German model of education, where students in America would be educated and trained for the primary purposes of filling out the American workforce, the needs of the American workforce, and it discussed setting out establishing a national set of standards, a national assessment, ultimately a national curriculum, a national database, so that kids can move from one state to another, and their record that they are developing toward workforce readiness would be available for potential employers and also for college admissions officers as well. And this plan was fairly well documented. It's not hard to find. If you type in "Dear Hillary," you can even type "Dear Hillary Bob Schaffer," you'll find that letter rather easily, because I submitted it into the congressional record when I got my hands on it. And just an interesting side note, because of the length of the letter, it exceeded the normal length that you were allowed to just submit things into the record. So I had to pay a considerable sum for the pages in the congressional record to have that letter filed. But it's there, and it's been referenced quite a lot. In fact, referenced quite a lot lately, because it does provide somewhat of an explanation to, as I say, these seemingly independent efforts that are taking place that, in my assessment, are not all that independent. They are, in fact, part of at least Mark Tucker's vision of the United States. It's a vision that you'll hear more from our panelists here in a minute. It is a vision that achieves some very rational goals of trying to elevate the education performance and standards of school children in the United States, their competitiveness when compared to international peers. But it does so in a very non-traditional, from an American perspective, direction, and that is to essentially erase the lines that exist between states by way of borders, to harmonize the efforts among what were created under our Constitution to be sovereign and independent states, complete with independent leadership, independent values, goals, cultures, and leadership as well. And to begin to move our country toward a more nationalized approach to public education. So the topics to be discussed today are not new in terms of their vision, but they are new for all of us because we're starting to see the building blocks put in place for effectively moving authority and power not just out away from our neighborhoods and our kitchen tables, as a matter of fact, but neighborhood schools, but also away from states and centralizing and consolidating that authority in Washington, D.C. So with that as a backdrop, let me just
want to say a couple words.
Okay, I'll go ahead and hand the microphone over, and that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
First, I want to say thanks to Bob and to the board today. We had a hearing earlier today. Paul and Dean is here also, and also Marcia Neal is here from the board. We appreciate the opportunity to speak before you and have a number of experts come in and speak to you. It was a great hearing. I think there were a lot of different views expressed there, and I think it was a great opportunity to talk about this topic of Common Core, which can be somewhat ethereal, but really matters at the classroom level. Before we get into it, I just want to say thank you to Emmett McGroarty from APP. I also want to say thanks to Pam Benigno. Is she here? She's out there. Okay. Ben DeGrow, also from Independence Institute. We thank you for hosting us today. And I'd like to thank everyone who's come today to speak on this issue. So I'm Jim Stergios. I'm the Executive Director of Pioneer Institute. We're very interested in this topic. We're from Massachusetts. We developed in the 1990s and early 2000s some of the best standards, academic standards in the country, together with school choice, really good assessments and good teacher tests, led to some of the fastest improvements in the country in terms of student achievement, to the place where we're #1 in the country, but also internationally competitive in the top 6 countries in math and science, according to the most recent administration of the TIMSS test. This is something that deeply interests us because of what we've seen in Massachusetts, the power of academic standards in driving content into the classroom of a high quality. So today what we'd like to do is have a number of panelists, a number of experts talk to you about the quality of Common Core compared to the quality of other state standards, whether in English language arts or math. We'd also like to have a discussion around some of the legal parameters around this issue. There are federal laws that actually have a role to play here and have had a role to play in terms of prohibiting certain federal involvements, and we'll be delving into that to some extent. We'll also be talking about the cost of Common Core to states and localities. The fact is, states and localities will pick up at least 90% of the cost of implementation. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is just introduce the panelists. Sandra Stotsky, Dr. Sandra Stotsky is the University of Arkansas, and she is someone who was within the Massachusetts Department of Education as well as on the Board of Education. During her tenure in the Massachusetts Department of Education, she was responsible for developing all of Massachusetts' curriculum frameworks, and they are considered to be among, if not the best in the country. That Ted Rebarber from AccountabilityWorks, he works on a number of different national policy issues, but he's someone who's deeply involved in developing assessments across states with collaborations that are not just with single states, but across states. Also a former Department of Education official at the United States level, though he likes to hide that. Bill Evers is a former assistant secretary. I had to tell him, is a former assistant secretary at the United States Department of Education. He also ran the schools in Iraq. He is someone who has deep interest and expertise across standards as well as testing in a number of different topics. And finally, Robert Scott, who is the former commissioner of education in Texas, was there in Texas for a number of years and drove some of the great reforms that were put into place there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone to Sandy.
Thank you. And could I just ask if someone is going to let us know when our minutes are almost up? So, fair.
They're up.
Thank you. I'm going to be addressing the low quality of the Common Core standards. I bring to my evaluation and my comments my experience in the Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 to 2003, where, as Jim has indicated, I was in charge of the development and revision of all the state's K-12 standards and its teacher licensure tests too, which I was able to coordinate. I have also been on Common Core's validation committee, and I will bring to bear some of my experience on that committee from 2009 to 2010. I'm going to speak to the following points: the low quality of Common Core's English language arts standards, especially in grades 6 to 12, which has been the focus of my concern; the non-transparent process that was used to develop Common Core standards, because I followed the development of those standards from the time that we heard about the project till well after the final version came out on June 2nd, 2010. I'm going to make a few comments about how Common Core's ELA standards are already damaging the K-12 curriculum, and then I will make a few remarks about the superior quality of Colorado's own English language arts standards, and ask why Colorado, along with a few other states, sold or traded in a silk purse for a sow's ear, because that's really what it got in return. The low quality of Common Core standards, its ELA standards, can be seen by looking at what they are. They are basically empty skill tests. And until we actually see the passages that the two testing consortia are developing for assessing those ELA standards, we really won't know if they are at the college level of difficulty and what they mean as far as reading level we expect of those who are going to be called college ready. I quote in my prepared paper, which has been entered into the record for the State Board of Education, so you can see all the remarks. I'm sorry, I'm doing it again. I simply don't speak into a microphone. I gotta make sure. The remarks that I quote indicating the problems with Common Core's ELA standards come from the Fordham Institute's own review in 2010. And I'm quoting from the remarks that Sheila Bird Carmichael, who was the reviewer for them at that time. I had reviewed all previous standards by Fordham, but at this point, someone else needed to do it. And Sheila details very clearly what all the problems were with the ELA standards. One then wonders how come they were given a B+ as a grade, because they certainly don't look as if they deserved anything more than a D. So this is a question I leave for you to think about. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more now about the non-transparent process that was used to develop Common Core standards. I have been involved not only in the Department of Education, but on many other civic committees in the community I lived in for most of my adult life. And the procedures that were followed for the development of Common Core violated every single procedure I ever knew. There were no minutes of meetings that we were able to approve. There were no live copies of comments, feedback that we were given. We were given summaries prepared for our eyes. In any event, we were not given any information that would have helped us to evaluate on the committee, the Common Core Validation Committee, whether the process was really authentic and met academic standards. I was one of the 5 people who refused to sign off that Common Core standards were internationally benchmarked. They weren't. And I refused to sign off that they were research-based, because they weren't. And the mathematician on the committee, whose name is James Milgram from Stanford, also refused to sign off. We were the only 2 who could evaluate the math or the ELA standards, and we knew that they were not internationally based, as benchmarked, or research-based. Now the question is, how are they actually damaging the English and reading curriculum today? I'm going to just give you a few of the high points of what the problems are. First problem is that it requires English teachers to spend over 50% of their reading instructional time on nonfiction or informational texts. The big problem here is that English teachers are not trained to teach informational texts, and reading teachers are not trained to teach literature. So you have two groups of teachers who are handling K-12, and neither is qualified to deal with everything that is tucked in to that K-12 strand. Moreover, there is absolutely no research, and I've checked this out with contemporary leading reading researchers, there is no research that suggests that reading informational texts in K-12 will make students more ready for college than reading complex literature, which is what probably most of us had when we went to high school years ago. And we know that from 1890, the Committee of 10, and well after World War II, what English teachers taught in the high school grades that was considered material to prepare students for college was complex literature. Second issue is that these standards will require drastic costs in order to change the coursework or the professional preparation programs or the professional development programs for prospective or current English teachers. They simply do not teach informational reading in their own subject. One of the examples that one of the architects of Common Core, David Coleman, recently indicated in a newspaper article defending what he was doing, because he was the one that hatched this idea and there's no research for it. He said that, well, you could have for mathematical reading Euclid's geometry. For those of you who know, Euclid's geometry used to be taught in grade 10 and is a set of proofs. It's not mathematical reading, it's actually mathematical geometry. And there is no way the English teacher in particular could do it, and it is unlikely that the math teacher would ever assign it as a reading assignment. It would be anything, ideally, what they would do in mathematics from day to day. Let me close by saying that Colorado's own English language arts standards were much better. Why do I say that? Again, I quote from the Fordham Institute's own review. In other words, I'm going to quote from the people who disagree with me, but their own reviews indicate, and I'm going to read off here, Colorado's standards for literary and non-literary text analysis are more thorough and detailed than the Common Core. And they go on to talk about Colorado's standards are also clearer and better than those presented in the Common Core. So this is something for the state and those of you who have some responsibility to think about why Colorado switched and has moved to an inferior product for its own teachers and schools to use. Thank you.
What I'm going to summarize some findings of a cost study that our organization did with Pioneer Institute. They looked at the national costs in implementing Common Core. I'm also going to touch on a couple other broader topics of how we find ourselves in this situation. As many of you know, a few years ago, a lot of state budgets were strapped. Many states are still digging out from that. The Obama administration held up, raised to the top money out of the stimulus funds as an incentive to states to adopt the Common Core. In order to receive a lot of those funds, states have to sign on the dotted line. Now, in many cases, states barely had any chance to review the Common Core standards, and in the great majority of cases, nearly all cases, they didn't undertake any serious financial or other feasibility analyses of what it would take to implement Common Core. As Congressman Schaffer pointed out, this is not a new idea. In fact, I was involved as well in '93 when the Clinton administration tried to push for a requirement that as a condition for receiving Title I dollars, elementary and secondary education dollars, on which the great majority of school districts are dependent, they would have to submit their state academic standards for approval, along with the rest of their application, to the Federal Department of Education. Did a piece for the Heritage Foundation, a number of others fought it, and that specific provision was removed so that states did not have to include copies of their state standards. They had to simply demonstrate that they did adopt some standards, but that was not part of the application that could be reviewed. So this is not a new idea. There have been efforts before. In this case, there is no statutory authority. I'm not going to get into all of that, but you have an initiative that's really being done with financial incentives. States looked at some of the benefits, very few looked at the larger costs. Our study found costs in 4 major areas. Testing, in many states, not all, but in many states, the testing costs will be higher on an ongoing basis. Professional development to retrain the teachers. By the way, our estimate, which came in at around $16 billion nationwide, only dealt with alignment. In other words, just pointing education in a different direction, not the cost of actually meeting these standards. And so professional development to retrain teachers and orient them to new standards. Textbooks and instruction materials which have to be revamped, and significant technology infrastructure for most states. And we're encouraging states to do these cost analyses. A lot of states are really just focusing now on the fact that Common Core tests are coming online, and then the online assessments, but they're going to be ready in the next couple of years. So there's been a few districts that have moved ahead, have used Common Core, but the reality of implementation is only starting to sink in. And while you did have 46 states sign on the dotted line when it was basically federal money and very little beyond that, the reality of implementation is starting to sink in. And you're seeing states like Utah rethink whether this is such a good idea. A number of states, such as Texas and Alaska, rejected it from the beginning. But others, like Utah and others, are rethinking it. In Indiana, the state superintendent recently lost his re-election, in part because of concern surrounding Common Core. And what we're talking about here is federal strings being attached, not only to the funding, but now for waivers to the state Title I laws, which are unworkable, which almost all the states are trying to get out of. So to remedy previous unworkable federal requirements, now the feds are saying, we'll only give you that if you agree to implement Common Core or something very similar. And once they agree to this, under these waivers, any future changes to Common Core to address issues on working out, to address specific Colorado needs, will have to be submitted to the Federal Department of Education for permission. The state will no longer have the final say on what standards are right, what students need to learn and be able to do. This is a bright line. This has never been true before in this country. And so this is being crossed, and we want to encourage more attention to both the cost and the benefits. And as Dr. Stotsky mentioned, there are questionable benefits, at least in some cases, and we think they ought to be weighed against the costs, as well as the principle of federalism.
So I'm Bill Evers. I'm a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I'm former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education for Policy. So I'm going to sort of take this from a parent or teacher or taxpayer or citizen point of view and how to sort of think about this. And it seems like you could think about this maybe in sort of kitchen table terms from a long run point of view and a short run point of view. So I think a lot of the short run point of view has to do with the operations of how this might play out in classrooms or in teachers' lives or in parents' lives as they're helping with homework. And the long run implications have to do with good and responsible government and the kind of life as citizens that children and grandchildren are going to enjoy. So the first short run kitchen table question, it seems to me, are the national standards going to make a positive difference? Right? I mean, are they going to make a positive difference? So I think the answer is no, and for 3 reasons. The first reason is that state standards have already reduced, to the extent possible, the differences in classroom to classroom in teaching quality. So let me just restate this one more time. State standards have already reduced the classroom to classroom teaching quality differences as much as possible. So you have standards in your state. Some states have better standards, some have worse. But to the extent that you're going to drag up, push up, induce whatever improvements in the variability of classroom to classroom, you already got this in the standards regime that have been in place for quite a number of years. And this is discussed in a study by Tom Lovelace of the Brookings Institution, and others have concurred. Number two, what about countries that have national standards and countries that don't have national standards? Well, you know, we have this correct understanding of the United States that in many ways we are a different country from many of the countries in the world, sometimes called American exceptionalism. So we have a different kind of situation, and almost all countries in the world are more centralized. The national government has more power. Often any local government are really just total creatures of the national government. They're just sort of like subdivisions of the national government. So almost all countries in the world have national curriculum, have national tests, have national standards. So the problem then is, of the countries in the world that do better than the United States in international comparisons, almost all of them have national standards. And of all the countries that do worse than the United States, almost all of them have national standards and national tests and national curriculum. So it's a wash. You can't tell. I mean, the bad countries, the weak countries have national standards, and the countries that are stronger have national standards. So it doesn't tell anything. But there is something that's worth noting, and that is two countries that are very, very much like the United States culturally, Australia and Canada, are less centralized. They're more decentralized, especially Canada, even than the United States when it comes to education. And so there's been international comparative testing going back to the 1970s. So the United States has maintained a sort of steady mediocrity, no gains. Canada and Australia have improved. Canada was mediocre like us back in the early 1970s. They have climbed into the higher ranks. So one of the things may be the dynamic of inter-province competition. I know from having read literature in Canada that the college systems in the different provinces compete with each other in regard to how good they are, and this dynamic helps improve Canadian higher education. I'm sure the same thing is going on for them in elementary and secondary. Okay, so last is really how good are these standards? So when the standards were written, Professor William McCollum of the University of Arizona was one of the three writers of the Common Core National Curriculum Content Standards for Math, and he was the only actual mathematician among the writers, said the following, quote, "The overall standards are not high, certainly not in comparison with other nations, including East Asia, where math education excels." Okay, so they're mediocre, they're not very good. Okay, they're not at the level of high-performing countries. So now, how actually practical are they? Well, a central part of geometry, just to give you one example, are congruent and similar triangles. So if you think back to your geometry, which I know, looking out at my audience here, you all remember completely. So you decompose a problem and you try and use the theorems that you learned to address the component parts. You systematically do this, you line this up, QED at the end. And a major part of this is looking for similar, or the possibility of similar and congruent triangles, and there's a standard algorithm. If you reach back in the depths of your memory, side, angle, side, angle, side, angle, this is an echo that's still back there somewhere. You don't remember exactly how to apply this anymore, but you could learn it again, right? So that's the standard algorithm for dealing with similar and congruent triangles. Well, the national math standards are not going to use that anymore. There's a new method, another method. It involves rotation and point, and it's used for college math majors. It has never, ever, in the history of instruction, been effectively used in K-12 in any country, in any state or province, in any city, in any school district, ever. They're imposing this on the whole country. Are your teachers in Colorado currently prepared to teach this? I don't think so. All right, so now the long-term question has to do with liberty and citizenship and what kind of a country and what kind of a state we live in. And so we have a system in the United States of protections and checks and balances to guard our liberties and to give protection and freedom to individuals and families in our society. And so what is federalism? So that's a major component of this. And this federal system with our state governments, our national government, even our counties, you can see it in the debate over Obamacare, over the Affordable Health Care Act. So remember the Supreme Court decision on this. The Obama medical plan centralizes medical care, and it forced the states to expand Medicare, and there's this Supreme Court decision that you all remember. So it's part of that decision, and it wasn't the main thing focused on, was that the federal government cannot force the states to increase Medicare, and they cannot use the threat of federal financing penalties in order to do so. And this part of the decision was supported 7-2, so in the Supreme Court. So it meant that not just Republicans or people nominated by Republicans, this was broadly supported across the Supreme Court. Okay, so why is federalism important? Well, it makes it possible for competition among the states. And another Supreme Court decision, not the Obamacare one, said that if you have a single government in charge of everything, you don't have important structural constraint. This way, by having federalism, we provide protection from arbitrary power. People can move to other jurisdictions. Institutions, businesses, churches, whatever, can move, charities can move to other places that are better suited to them. Now, I just want to read a quick quote. So federalism is not only the distinction and rivalry among the federal government and the states, but it's also a rivalry among the states and among the local governments within the states. So economist Richard McKenzie wrote that the founders of the American system sought to disperse power among many different and competing governments at state, federal, and local levels, end of quote. The insight of competitive federalism, so I'm just gonna pretend I'm Bob here and bring out my, I'm supposed to close pretty soon. Here's my Constitution. So the insight of competitive federalism is that 51 state school boards are better than one in the federal government, one single executive branch office. And 15,000 local boards are better than 51 state offices or one federal office. And this is all to the benefit. Okay, so just to conclude, federal usurpation of state activity or interstate cartels or interstate cooperation led by the feds destroy the Madisonian constitutional system of federalism. And this is a system of federalism that better matches, better relates voters' preferences to policies, and that thereby improve government performance through competitive pressure, and that protect individual liberty from arbitrary power. And so this is a long-term kitchen cabinet issue for every American who cares about liberty, who cares about checks and balances against arbitrary power. And the Common Core is a threat to this Madisonian system of American competitive federalism, as well as being a weak program academically, a program that is difficult to implement because it has utopian ideas about things that can be taught to K-12, which historically have been shown not to be able to be taught in K-12, and there is no reason that a national curriculum will be an improvement over a decentralized one. Thank you.
Can I borrow your Constitution? I will give it back. I'm going to start with a quote that picks up where Bill left off, and I want to read this. If Congress can apply money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they may take the care of religion into their own hands. They may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish and pay them out of the public treasury. They may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. I'm going to paraphrase to be short. In short, everything from the highest object of state legislation down to the most minute object of police would be thrown under the power of Congress. Those words were spoken by James Madison on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1792. They were debating a cod fisheries bill and whether or not it was appropriate for the Congress to appropriate funds in support of the cod fisheries. And he was lamenting, if we do this, where will this end? Gosh, Congress could take education into its hand. The framers were, I have the utmost faith and confidence in them because they saw this coming. And we should always look back. And Sandy, that process you described really existed for two reasons. One, they could have never gotten away with it had they had to do so in the light of day. So it had to be a secretive process with no open records, open meetings, no minutes, transcripts, and the comments summarized rather than people reading them verbatim. They could have never gotten away with it with the modern press age. We all live in a 24-hour, sometimes 20-minute news cycle. They would have gotten caught. But ultimately, the real reason is because the sentiment among some of the proponents and creators of these standards is that they simply know better than the people what their children need to know. There is a very elitist side to this, that the rest of us are intellectually incapable of explaining what we expect of our education system for our kids, and only they know. Because when I ask them who controls these standards, who gets to rewrite them, who gets to be in the room, that no one could answer. I found out this morning that the standards have now been copyrighted by the Council of Chief State School Officers. So an unelected, unappointed body now controls those standards, and either you have to go to the U.S. Department of Education or the Council of Chief State School Officers, apparently, in order to make changes in the future. Interestingly enough, being an attorney, I did a little research and came across several federal laws that relate to the U.S. Department of Education's proper role and function with respect to curriculum. The very act that created the department, says the U.S. Department of Education cannot get involved in state and local curriculum decisions. The General Education Provisions Act says they cannot get involved. And even as late as 2001, No Child Left Behind, the department may not get involved in curriculum decisions. So how are they doing this? They're simply using stimulus dollars to pay people to do that which they are prohibited to do, and simply saying, it's not us, we're not doing it. Yes, we're in the room, yes, we're helping prescribe this, but it's really not us. It's this other entity that's not elected and not subject to open records and open meetings. And by the way, there's another law that says they may not create a national test for students unless Congress explicitly authorizes them to do so by other law. They didn't do that, though. They created two. They created two consortia, and you have to pick one if you want to be part of this system. So their argument seems to be, we need to have this thing. And we heard this today at the hearing. Very good hearing, very robust discussion. We need to have this thing so that there may be uniformity among the states. Well, I happen to think that competition and some differentiation among the states is part of the reason this nation has prospered and survived, is that I was always comparing myself to Massachusetts, striving to raise our standards to the level of Massachusetts, and California for math, and Minnesota for math, and even Singapore. We would look to their math standards as the pinnacle of what we should strive for in the state of Texas. And there's some better ways to do this. You can continue. Yes, I value comparing our students. I was one of the first states that joined the American Diploma Project so that our graduation standards could be compared to other states, so we could raise them and improve our scores and our students' performance. The National Assessment of Education Progress is a test that is a sample that we participate in. We also participated in the 3rd International Math and Science study, TIMSS International, and we were going to participate in PISA, but that kind of got a little bit, they wanted us to adhere to Australian contract law, which we weren't about to do. So the outcome is a couple of things are going to happen. And you'll probably see the drumbeat if they get around to reauthorizing No Child Left Behind. You'll hear I guess, a recycling of the big theme from the reauthorization in '93 and '94, which was the Clinton Improving America's Schools Act. They wanted content standards, but they also wanted this thing called opportunity to learn standards. You know, let's think this through. If standards are common among all the states, how come states get to spend different? How come states get to use different materials? How come states' teacher colleges are not teaching the same way? You know, so inevitably the uniformity will reach beyond the standards and into the how of education, I believe. I've seen it happen. I've seen the assessment system drive not just the what, but the how. And I've spoken out against it in Texas when I saw that too many school districts were not focusing on the curriculum, they were focusing on too many benchmark tests and too many practice tests and not focusing on what kids needed to do. The other question is, as I said, who gets to change these standards? Who are they subject to open records? Are they subject to open meetings? And ultimately, who gets the bill? Because what happens is when you change your education standards, that drives a whole bunch of decisions and money, spending. New textbooks, new instructional materials, new professional development for teachers, and assessments. I estimated the cost for Texas, if we'd scrapped our current system and gone to Common Core, would have been an initial investment of $2.5 to $3 billion. So those are the types of decisions that are going to be thrust upon you in the future as you move through this. And I'll stop there and let Jim open it up for questions.
Sure. Maybe we could have a little live play even here if somebody has comments on it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just a couple of quick comments there. First, I think that codfish, the funding was to come to Massachusetts, so we really want to. It's our state fish, by the way. I just want to build on something that Bill was saying a little before, where he was talking about the long-term impacts, and it's something that he and Jay Green and a number of other folks developed an initiative around, which was basically questioning Common Core on the basis of what does long-term innovation look like. None of us is happy with where our schools are. We want to see further improvement. But just to give you a sense of the kind of uniformity that, again, Robert Scott was talking about, it can extend into things that are core missions, if you will, for many of our organizations, things like choice. To give you one example, Tony Bennett, the former superintendent in Indiana, a supporter of Common Core, took it so far that they actually imposed Common Core on private schools. So you start asking, once you start getting Common Core into all of the different schools, at what point do you really have options as parents? Can you opt out of the public system? That is actually a troubling matter. Does that get into homeschoolers? Are they going to have to follow the same sort of thing? Another thing just to take a look at in that regard is, and this goes back to the uniformity issue that Robert was talking about, the two testing consortia are not only developing tests, they're developing curricular materials and instructional practice guides. I can tell you that in Massachusetts, what was wonderful about the way our reforms worked was that the people at the state level didn't have a bout of hubris. They basically said, here are the standards we want you to meet, here are the tests we're going to use. You as a teacher, you're going to have to figure out how you do it. We're not going to tell you to teach exactly this way. But with these national tests come curricular materials and practice guides that frankly show a level of disrespect to teachers as individuals. Each teacher will have certain strengths that you need to build upon, and will have certain weaknesses that you need to remedy as a leader of a school. But that is getting to the place where we're trying to automate, quote unquote, a scientific method of teaching, which frankly is just not what we're looking for. One final point before we go into sort of a little bit of discussion, questions, and that sort of thing, and that is, it goes back to what Bill was talking about with federalism, but also some of the comments that Ted was making, and that is, American education is and has never been and should not be about simply workforce development. We're not looking just to slot people into jobs. We have always had, from the time of Horace Mann on, frankly from the very start of the Massachusetts experiment, the experiment with John Adams, written into our Constitution and thereafter into many other state constitutions, is the fact that our goal is not just to get people to be competitive in the labor market, but to be really great citizens, to be able to participate in the multiplicity of different jurisdictions, different governments. That is a core piece of what we're about, and that is truly not something that we see coming out of Common Core whatsoever. So with that, what I do is just ask folks, do you have any kind of comments among each other in terms of just responding to points that you've made or you've heard along the way so far? Go do this. Yeah.
So my mind is always sparking off of the brilliant comments of the panel here. So one thing that occurred to me is something that Sandy has talked about but somehow did not come out in any of our remarks, and that is high school. By the time children get to high school, they often already have some ideas about their life. And this imposes one size fits all. And really, there should be some multiple pathways in high school. By the time of high school, it's not that every kid should be treated exactly the same. So we might end up in the course of some things expanding on that, but that's just a very brief part of it. Okay, another thing that did not come out in any of our conversations is teacher evaluations. So this is a big new reform development in recent years, but let's say you're a teacher, or let's say you're a leader of a teachers union. You look at this new thing that's coming, and the teachers have not been trained in it yet, millions and billions of dollars have not yet been spent on that, and you want to have multiple year based teacher evaluations that cross, the old standards and the new standards. So that means we should wait 5, 7 years, something, before we have enough. Teachers have been trained for enough years, and then after they're trained, they've had enough multiple years to do teacher evaluation. So you're pushing at least partially test-based teacher evaluation 7 years into the future. Now, of course, there's some people that want that, but I'm just saying, bye-bye that. Okay, another thing that occurred to me is that when you were talking about how the department is paying other people to do things that the department is explicitly prohibited from doing, is there is a legal doctrine that this is called mischief, and that they're not supposed to do this. Specifically, government agencies are not supposed to pay somebody to do something that they're forbidden to do. That is, judges are not dumb, and they figured this out, and they said this is illegal and it's mischief. So Bob was saying something about the Dear Hillary letter and Mark Tucker's Education and the Economy group, and it's fascinating that the two leading figures in the Gates Foundation that have put forth a lot of the money that's helped fund a lot of this activity, both the creation of the standards and the partly policy implementation, partly public relations relating to it, are people that became active in the school reform movement precisely in Mark Tucker's shop. And several of the people, the head of Achieve, which wrote the actual standards, and the deputy to Marty Duncan in this administration, were people who in the Clinton administration were the people in charge of pushing for national standards back in the 1990s. So some people talk about the institutions, is it the governor's lobbying group? Is it the chief scale school officers group? Is it the Hunt Institute? Is it Achieve? Is it the Fordham Foundation? Is it, yeah, it's those institutions, but actually it's a set of people who go back to these days, some of it to the time of George H.W. Bush, some of the time of Clinton, and they have persisted and they have traveled and populated different institutions, and they got together because they got old enough to be in strategic locations and put this through. And they're the people that did it. This did not well up from state legislators saying, gee, we're in terrible trouble. We need, for some reason, to compare exactly a kid in Grand Junction to a kid in Augusta, Maine, and if we can't do that, we can't possibly improve education. That didn't happen. It was people that all along, for decades, favored national uniformity of curriculum in the United States.
Could I add something?
You could, because I'm finished.
You should take the...
Oh, I can
You
use...
got a nearer one.
Yeah.
I'll use this one. I'm so glad you brought up the point about the alternative high schools, because what is so utopian about Common Core as a movement and as a policy is that it expects all students to go through until grade 11 or 12 and then go on to college and career. There is no other country I'm aware of in the world that expects its entire student population to go on to either college or career after 12 years of schooling. Most of them have alternative high schools, and Finland, which was mentioned this morning, despite what people think about it, it has over 50% who choose its excellent technical vocational high schools, less than 50 who choose its academic high schools, and there are 8 different tracks in its academic high schools. So this is a very different situation from what is being promoted by means of the Common Core movement in this country. This is not to say that you don't want to assess and make sure that the 4 major subjects are taught in both kinds of schools. This is vitally important. But students are given choices in most other countries, particularly the most industrialized ones. Germany, Denmark, Finland, and others will all talk about the different types of alternative high schools. And that's where the workforce needs of their countries are met very clearly, because business has a very direct involvement in these vocational technical schools. They don't operate independent of the communities that have the schools. So that's all I wanted to say. I think it's something we've totally missed in this country, but Massachusetts has done very well, as Jim knows, with its regional vocational technical schools, and this is something that nobody wants to even hear about, even though there are waiting lists for these schools. It's a matter of choice. So let me just put this down, and then anyone else who wants to say something, or we can have questions from the audience.
Questions, even people who are leaving that might have a question. Okay, questions?
Marsha, you want to come up and use the microphone
If you need it,
She seems like she has, well, what does the television need?
Yeah, then we need the microphone.
I think it might
need the
be good.
microphone.
Okay.
Thank you all, and thank you for the earlier presentation. It was excellent. I really have some questions real specific to Colorado. I need advice for Colorado. Who was it that was writing the standards with you? When you said you wrote this, you were in this committee. Who was the committee? Who was it that took on writing those standards with you?
You mean in Massachusetts?
Yes, in Massachusetts.
Oh,
but they were national standards, weren't they?
She's confusing. She thought that when you were on the review committee.
Oh, the
We started
validation.
out talking about
The evaluation
the
committee.
whole thing about English and reading and
Right.
all of that.
Okay.
The English standards for Common Core, the standards for Common Core's ELA subject were written by 3 people formally: David Coleman, a woman named Susan Pimentel, and a third person, Jim Patterson, who worked for ACT, but he never seemed to be involved. And the only people who've been going around speaking about the standards, who are seen as the chief architects, are David Coleman and Sue Pimentel. So
And
it's
who
fair.
assigned them? I mean, who gave
Well,
them
this
that
is one
job?
of the big mysteries of life. That's part of the non-transparency. Neither of them has ever taught from from K to 12. They have no teaching background, and nobody knows exactly why either of them was chosen. Because if anybody had been thinking from the point of view of common sense, if you were to try to develop college readiness standards in either math or English, who would you go for? I've tried this test question on a number of people. High school math or English teachers, and college level math or humanities faculty. Who else really could decide what a good college readiness line looks like? It's the people across a variety of institutions in each state who could then tell you approximately what you needed to have come from your high schools that would qualify for college readiness for admission to their colleges. But those were the 2 groups that were left out.
Okay.
That was one of the important clues to me on the validation committee. The two groups of teachers and college level faculty that you would expect to develop standards for college readiness were the two groups left out. Who was on these development committees? Mainly people in test assessment.
Okay.
That was where the money was to be made, and that was where the kind of empty standards in English were to come from. Skills.
Okay, let me, the reason that I asked was because Colorado's been very involved, as all of you people in the audience know, with you know, designing and building their own standards for a long time. And it did come out of the national governors and the CCA, the chief school officers. So we were all working in this direction, and this is where we were going. And I asked you this question this afternoon. That's what one of my big questions. When and how did it somehow shift to become the federal?
It hasn't exactly. Let me say, in 2006, the Hunt Institute and the Alliance for Excellence in Education began this. But remember, these are just like institutional names attached to people that have been trying to do this for decades. So they were then joined by the lobbying arms of the governors and the lobbying arms of the state school officers. And then they were joined by Achieve and the Fordham Foundation.
Yes.
And then they were joined by ACT and the College Board.
Okay.
And Gates is a funder of almost all of those groups individually and paid for a large amount of the whole process of actually doing it, as well as, in a sense, the overhead of those organizations.
I'm getting that, but I really want to get back to what Colorado's doing and what the answer is there in Colorado.
But Colorado has adopted the Common
I know
Core
that, but I want to go back a little bit before that. Okay.
All right.
We designed our own standards. We adopted our own standards. I was glad to hear you say that our standards were higher in some
The
places.
latest version.
I'm sure they were not as high as Massachusetts, but you know, we had our own standards. We're moving ahead to adopt our own assessments and have this great system. Suddenly, and I again ask you the question of when the federal government said, "Oh, we want you to, you know, apply for Race to the Top, and in exchange for doing so, then you have to sign on." That seems to be the turning point.
This was in 2009 with the stimulus
Yeah, I know.
and the deadline was set for 2010.
Okay, and let me finish, and then you guys can all, because I keep getting sidetracked here. We have been prepared to do our own testing and, you know, do Colorado testing, and that's what we've been working on. And I've been told by various people that we, including Mr. Schaffer, because our bill is Senate Bill 191, which has to do with teacher evaluation. It's a great bill. I'm very committed to it, and we're well in 2-3 years into it. Now we're hearing that if we don't withdraw from the Common Core, they're going to take back their money or whatever it is they're going to do. But my question has been, can we continue to develop Senate Bill 190?
The bottom line is the getting out of Common Core, if that's what you decide to do, won't prevent you from moving forward with 191 or any other bill. There are ways, some of the cost efficiencies that, there are ways that the cost efficiencies under Common Core, can be accomplished working with other states if that's important to you in terms of sharing costs with other states. But getting out will not prevent you from moving forward. There is a question of the funds that were tied to Common Core, the federal dollars, and how much of that will be pulled back, and others may want to comment on that. But I think apart from that, you can certainly move forward.
Well, and one last thing, there were several comments, and we've heard similar things about how much of our present standards are our standards and how much of them are federal standards. And Elaine, I think, mentioned that 2 of the 7 were federal, and I've heard that ours were as little as 12% was federal and the rest was state. And I keep getting different answers
Okay.
now.
I've spoken to a number of people, and I also know from the national scene. Apparently in Colorado you have 11 sets of standards because you're covering all of the other subjects in the
Yes.
curriculum. 9 of those 11 are state standards. you can continue and do whatever you want with those 9. There would be art, music, and foreign languages, whatever else. The 2 that are Common Core now are math and English language arts and reading. Those are totally now Common Core standards, because that was what the vote on the board legally meant, that you had to adopt word for word Common Core's mathematics and English language arts standards. That commits you to having to use those 2 strands of the total 11. However, you were allowed to add up to 15% more in each of those areas from your own existing standards, or make them up, because this is what happened in Massachusetts.
But you can vote to reverse this too.
Well, the vote, by the way, the board originally voted 3 to 4, right, Mr.
Right.
Okay.
I'd really like to know why we were so heavily lobbied by very conservative people like Chucker Finn and Jeb Bush. Where do they fit in?
This is a whole other story
I'd like to know
in
that too.
itself.
Well, we do know some things. We know some things.
Well, I'll comment on that.
See, that's,
You want to have to follow the money conversation on that?
who wants to start, walk
I
into
mean,
that
I'll just
one?
say, you can very easily follow the money into who funded those organizations. As Bill mentioned and others have mentioned, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funds a vast array of social justice organizations, academic institutions. The people who did the validation study on the Common Core were funded by the Gates Foundation. So I would really hope that in the future we have an independent third party that can take a look at these things. And in the end, as Sandy mentioned this morning, will we ever get to see the test questions and the cut scores? And I mean, the real important things that are going to drive the outcomes. You know, their argument seems to be we did all this money, spent all this money since 1965, and we haven't moved the needle. So it occurs to me they've just bought the needle that they can move themselves.
Just for folks, I mean, one of the reasons why Pioneer Institute is involved in this from the get-go is that lack of an independent party that's taking a look at the quality, the cost, the federal and legal issues. Many people on this panel, but in addition also former counsels general from the United States Department of Education, Jim Milgram from Stanford, a number of really high-quality academic researchers have delved into this topic for Pioneer, together with partner organizations like the American Principles Project, as well as the Pacific Research Institute in California, along with a number of other folks who are out there in Washington State, et cetera, et cetera. The point is to build a group of folks who really want to provide an independent voice on this. We've not taken any funding from Gates or opponents of Common Core because we want this to be the very best academic, peer-reviewed, academic quality research that we put out on all these topics, because we think it's really important. And as we get into the questions, I just want to say one thing clear to all of you and folks who may see this video at some point. We're looking to work with more organizations. We're looking to work with many folks here locally, but also in other states. It's important to get more on board, to question, to ask the questions that these folks are trying to ask, as well as in part answer, because it's really critical for your states to move ahead educationally.
And one bit of full disclosure, I don't harbor any personal animosity towards any of the folks involved in this. They're good friends of mine. Dave Coleman is a very good friend of mine. I just happen to disagree on how something he's involved with has been used. Stephanie Sanford, who's at the Gates Foundation now, who just announced she's going to be joining Mr. Coleman at the College Board, is also a very good friend of mine. We've been friends for many years. I don't begrudge them what they're intellectually trying to do. I'm simply warning them about the adverse effects of this much power. And I'll said this morning, say it again. This is not a partisan issue for me. I would not give this power to Reagan. I would not give this power to Bush. I would not give this power to Kennedy or anybody else. That's not the issue for me. The issue for me is the proper role of the federal, state, and local governments involved here.
I just want to add a slightly different point on this, which is the proponents of Common Core have tried to create an aura of inevitability, that this train has left the station. They often run around saying there are 46 states that have signed up, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is that what it means to actually implement Common Core is really just starting to sink in a lot of places. People are really just starting to focus on what did we actually sign up for? what does this mean? Not only what is the cost, although that's something we think is important, what benefits are we really going to get out of this? How is this developed? What are the implications down the road for maintaining our state authority in this fundamental area of state authority, the final say on what students learn? And so you are starting to see states rethink, is this really what we want? Utah is pulled out of a state consortium that they were in. Indiana is certainly taking another look at it, and the state superintendent was defeated there and was a major advocate of Common Core. You are starting to see states focus on this. With all the attention at the national level, Obamacare, the health care bill, the constant fiscal cliffs that seem to come every few months, a lot of this has flown under the radar screen. And so the Common Core has really not been at the top of some of these discussions, and the federal role really behind that. And so I think that's coming into play, and I'll just give one example of why. Like a lot of these initiatives, there was some soaring rhetoric about how this was going to transform education. There was a lot of hope and change behind this, and how this is really going to solve all of our problems somehow. And a lot of the promises that were made. So for example, the two-state consortium, which got hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars under the stimulus fund, made all kinds of claims in their grant proposals about how they're going to transform testing, and they're going to have all these innovative items and innovative methods, and they're going to do away with single event testing. You're going to have multiple assessments. You don't just have one assessment. You have these innovative items. You can have these extended performance project items, et cetera, et cetera. And systematically since then, this is just one piece, but it's an important one because testing drives a lot of what happens in schools. They've been backing away as they've had to figure out how to implement this. From PARC, one of the two consortia, backed away from some of the earlier assessments during the year. SBAC, the other consortia, backed away from some of the extended performance tasks. They've reduced them. They still haven't committed to the dollar figure of what they're going to charge states. So you're seeing again and again reality hitting rhetoric, and that process is just getting underway. So I think people need to take a look at it and understand that this is not this freight train has not left the station. There's still plenty of time to rethink this.
So just to give some empirical facts on inevitability. So back in the 1990s, there was something called the New Standards Project that 22 states, some of you remember the New Standards Project, 22 states adhered to. Mark Tucker was heavily involved in that one too. All these states abandoned this national standards and national testing project. In 1997-98, the Clintons had, I left out George H.W. Bush had history standards that were voted down 99-1 by the U.S. Senate. The Clinton, the national history standards, the Clinton administration in 1997-98, 6 states joined it, and the U.S. Department of Education signed a contract for test development. It was overturned by Congress, and the test items that were created were given to NAEP. NAEP is the National Sample Test. Goals 2000, that was the second Clinton attempt at national curriculum. 48 states, even more. 48 states, more than the Common Core. 5 years later, completely expired, and as economic or education historian Maris Vinovska says, it expired with little notice or regret. So
Could I just
it's
add,
not inevitable.
could I just add a couple of words, though, on the current reasoning, which came through this morning very clearly. What was the major justification being offered for Common Core by most speakers? It would enable us to have Colorado to be part of a multi-state, national, international dialogue on best practices, on standards that would be equal across the country. Nobody made the argument that they would make us internationally competitive, because it is well known that they are not making us internationally competitive. No one argued that they were research-based. I listened very carefully, because it is very clear by now that they're not research-based. So yes, for that tiny percentage of the children of the military and migrant workers, we are embarking on this standardization of the curriculum and standards and assessments for the entire country. It doesn't make sense. They are left with that as their only justification, because every other one has been shredded and decimated. No one can argue that there aren't a few children of the military who do move from state to state, or that there are a few migrant workers and other people who do move from state to state. But is that the reason to have a low quality set of standards for all states that will have an unknown college readiness line that is now, as I spoke to the person from higher ed who was on the first panel, they're now at the stage where they're beginning to talk to college level personnel, because that is where the Gates money is now going. We've got to get community colleges to make sure that students who are called college ready by means of a test can take credit-bearing courses after being admitted to higher education, community or four-year colleges. But that is the next and major prize that all of this, in my own judgment, was aiming for. So that's what you need to watch out for.
So you understand, if you take a
Can we just take any other questions from the audience, please?
Yes, my name is Dan. If anything that the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, the fiscal cliff has shown us, is that central planning does not work. Even when it supposedly is in their best interest, it doesn't work. They don't care. They really don't. That's all there is to it. The attitude of the White House, the Speaker of the House, the majority of the Senate, all attest to that. And I am not going to stand and have to live in a country that's downgraded like that. And because of that, and also because of something that was mentioned that, whether your kid goes to a government public school, a private school, or your homeschool, you cannot necessarily get out of this. I have a sister who's a chiropractor. She told me, I'm debating whether or not to get out of Medicare. Even if I do, I still won't be completely out of the system. With those two things said, what can we at the state level do to get Colorado out of this? And what can we do working in tandem with our state legislators? They are our allies, we are their allies, not our enemies. When the federal government pits us, they've been able to successfully pit us against each other. When we work together, they have to listen to us.
Right.
Thank you.
I have to commend the state board for having this hearing this morning. I mean, the question was how can Colorado still get out of this? And the answer is, it's still early in this process. The national tests have not yet been implemented. Some districts have moved forward on implementing, but not all. And so this is really not set in stone yet. And on your state board, which chose to effectively replace their own state standards in these areas, in English language arts and math, with the National Common Core, can vote to either go back or come up with something better. There's no reason you can't come up with something better, and Bob Schaffer mentioned that earlier today. And so right now, I think a good place to start, because they're at least taking another look at it seems, is your state board, and then you can certainly approach state legislators and the governor. But I think your state board right now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's really where the action's going.
Well, yeah, I do need to correct you. Other than the ability to convene and hold a hearing, as we did today, the state board has that authority. It was the state board that voted for Colorado joining the Common Core. Things have changed, though, even since 2010, when the board did that on a 4-3 vote. Marcia and I were on the 3 side of that equation. Here's the practical reality. The state board in Colorado doesn't really have that much authority. Got a lot of authority in certain areas: charter schools, teacher licensing, making sure the School Finance Act is being implemented properly, and a few other things. But when it comes to policy, we don't have a lot. The decision to direct the Commissioner of Education to commit the state to the Common Core and to consortia assessments were done by the State Board.
It's a Venus flytrap. You
However,
keep walking in, but you can't walk out.
However, if Colorado were to disconnect from the Common Core today, my prediction is the legislature would pass a law that would commit the state around us. Well, that may be fine, but and then with respect to the State Board, we resisted joining the Interstate Consortium on Assessments. We actually prevailed last year over English language and math assessments, designing them in state. But the legislature actually met in a special session for a different purpose. And in that special session, on the last day at the last hour, passed by law a directive that forced the State Board of Education to direct the commissioner to join the PART consortia.
Oh, that was how you did it.
Yeah,
It was under
I would
direct.
also think that your legislature, I don't know the leanings of the legislature here, but I did take a little time to go through Article 9 of your Constitution and was just thoroughly impressed that the framers of your Constitution went to great lengths to protect local control, using such words as the public school fund is inviolate. It may not be used for any other purpose than explicitly listed in this Constitution. Using such words to say that the elected board of directors of a school district are solely responsible for instruction in their district, and even going so far to prohibit the legislature and the state board from selecting textbooks for local schools. So perhaps the legislature could be reminded of that, either through public action or potentially litigation if they seem to tend to violate that. But anyway, I was just really impressed at the exquisite nature of the protections that were placed there.
And the courts, by the way, have defended that provision fairly well in recent years.
I would urge something that we've seen in Indiana, and that is engage with your local officials, your local school officials, educate local parents. You can see a brush fire catch pretty quickly where parents get really engaged on this issue, where they do want to have a level of control of what gets taught to their kids. And we've seen that actually punish specific individuals in elections who were supportive of Common Core. Once that happens once or twice, you will see that people will start coming around and saying, maybe this is something we should pay more attention to. So I would urge you to do as much as possible just to educate people about what's coming down the line. That if you do proceed for another 1.5 or 2 years, it will be very difficult to pull out. And I think that's actually a pretty powerful argument to make. Any other questions? Okay. So I'd just like to close by saying two things. One is, again, to the Board of Education, to Bob, to other board members here today. We really appreciate the opportunity to have a discussion, open debate. People had different views on the board, great questions. That's not something we've been able to have with any great frequency around the country, and that's simply because folks that you heard some of the individuals here talk about on the panel here today, whether Fordham Institute or Achieve Incorporated, et cetera. So we've tried to set up a debate, open debate, because we believe where there is open debate, we win. So we greatly appreciate the opportunity to do it here in Colorado, and we hope to share this with folks around the country. We appreciate your attention and your attendance this evening. Thanks very much for being here.